Hi, welcome to Positively Sparking, a podcast on internet marketing, online productivity, and business. Today I'm with Phil Argent, Chief of Digital at ginfestival.com, and a man whose career spans across the whole lifetime of the online world. We chat today about how the web has changed, the key things you need for online success in 2017, and the rise of new digital roles in the boardrooms of the corporate world. Hey Phil, welcome to the podcast.
Hello Phil, how are you?
I'm pretty good. It's good to have you here.
Well, it's excellent to finally touch base with you.
Exactly so. And Phil, you and I know each other a little bit, but for those of us who don't have the pleasure of knowing you, tell us who you are and what you do.
So my name's Phil Argent. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and the Head of Digital for ginfestival.com. I'm new to the role. I've been here for 6 months, and fundamentally I was introduced to the business to scale the scale the conversation.
Scale the conversation. That's quite a job statement, Phil.
Yeah, I think the best way to explain it is, I think, to give you some context to the reason why I'm here is that when it was introduced to me, the idea of coming to Gin Festival, one of the things that was very, very obvious was the scope of the conversation that was happening on digital, be it Facebook particularly, that was being reflected through the Gin Festival. So there was some kind of hunch within the business that they needed someone to join the two conversations together, which is fundamentally where I come in, which is understanding the fundamental DNA of the digital capabilities that we could employ, and technically in the same sentence understand how to get the engagement of the audience and the conversation they're having with each other into our business. So I'm here really basically looking at the relationship between the face-to-face transaction and how we turn that into an ongoing digital relationship.
Which is very much a modern day 2017 role. So that aspect of connecting the real world with the online world is very much a new role, which is what we're going to talk about today, the kind of advancement of digital and these new positions that we see out in the marketplace. But Phil, let's go back to what path took you to becoming a head of digital. How did that happen? What career path does someone need?
Right, okay. Well, giving this some thought, this question is that it's not particularly relevant where I started in the past, but to some extent it's the DNA of the thinking that I've always had that's relevant. So throughout my career, one of the things that I've kind of tried to embrace is continue to do something you're good at. So I went to university in 88 to 92, and fundamentally I was looking at computer-aided design and manufacturing, and at the time the internet was obviously, it wasn't even born to some extent. Computers were still very much unknown in terms of their full capability. But what I fundamentally engaged with was trying to fix things in a different way using the new technology that no one knew how to use. So to start off with, basically, I looked at creating an opportunity where basically I was looking at everything that was new in the technology field. And one of the things that was very new was obviously the internet. So I stepped off from university, went to work for Virgin, which was a very modern thinking company in terms of how to get to a customer. And they were very much kind of like advocates of doing what seemed to be right and embracing any technology that basically assisted that. I mean, when I worked at Virgin at the European head office there, I think we were using video conferencing back in 93, 94, 95.
That's amazing.
And I think and I think at the same time we were looking at Microsoft 3.1 as the software that was being used within the business. But we were using that alongside some massive computer programs that were basically running the retail empire. So what I did was spend some time working for Virgin, and basically the engineering of kind of future thinking and fixing things using unknown ways was something that I embraced within Virgin as well, which is kind of like they'd probably call it being an entrepreneur, but I think I was much more of an intrapreneur, really. And then from Virgin, someone tapped me on the shoulder one day and said, "Have you heard about this company called Quicksell, which was an online auction platform?" And it was very early days, so it was in 96, 97. And Tim Jackson, who wrote Richard Branson's autobiography Virgin King, had actually identified and seen eBay in its rawest form in San Francisco, and managed to get some investment to do the same thing in the UK in a slightly different way, and at the same time gain investment through an IPO to look at the whole of the Western Europe and all the European languages that the US eBay platform wasn't working on. So I was fundamentally, I joined that business within as kind of a sales and marketing position, but I'd always thought that I need to go with where the ideas go. So less about where the old-fashioned business opportunities lie, but more where the future thinking was, really.
That makes a lot of sense. And that aspect you mentioned there of in Virgin, you learned how to fix things in new ways. That must be such a big part of being head of digital, or any role which is digitally focused. It's certainly a big thing in digital marketing, where a new avenue comes out or a new platform. Well, and then we suddenly have to learn how to use it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that seems to be very relevant at the moment is that the pace of innovation and the pace of new ideas is something that is constantly iterating. And I think people are constantly trying to come up with new ways to re-engage and optimize and manage their businesses, and fundamentally use digital to do so. But an awful lot of people don't know if it's going to work. So I think you have to kind of, or certainly the way I've gained momentum is that you've got to take away any assumptions that anything will work, which I think is really relevant to the future, is that you've got to assume that there are things that will always be unknown and you have to test them. So that whole principle in terms of, like, you could call it entrepreneurialism, but you could also call it engineering, which is the faster you learn that something doesn't work correctly, the faster you can then learn what does work correctly. So, so basically I took my learnings, fundamentally the DNA that I've got from my many years of working at Virgin, took them to QXL, which was a $220 million VC-funded startup, and basically sat in an operations role for best part of 4 years, learning basically how to break things constantly.
What a great role!
Yeah.
Sounds fun.
I have to say, Phil, out of all the roles I've ever done, that was probably one of the most exciting. Some of the people I actually worked with, and I can honestly say to this day, were pioneers in terms of, like, Tim Jackson, who left QXL and has gone on to be a kind of a VC funder of some capacity. Other peers of mine, Mark Sharon, who was very senior within the successes of TripAdvisor, a guy called Julian Passard, who went from QXL to Overture to Google, and now is a fairly senior player at Airbnb. And the list goes on and on. Is that I think my peer group back then learned some things that no one's ever going to learn, really. And now we operate some 15 years later at the forefront of basically bringing any new ideas in at any point with the right philosophy of how you get them going, basically.
Great stuff.
Yeah, so that's how I ended up ultimately. I after QXL, I decided that I'd actually try and start my own number of startups, and I probably spent best part of 10 years building a number of different startups. Some of them made money, some of them were merely really an investment opportunity that did or didn't pay off. And with a recent move, I decided that I'd basically go and offer my experience and services to a high growth, high potential startup, basically, which is Gin Festival. So there I am today.
There we go. And so, Phil, in that time, you've had quite an adventure there across the beginnings of the online world, when things were so much different. There was no Google, there was no social media, there was most of the things that we see today in a very different form. I'm actually so impressed that eBay existed back in the late 1990s. I wasn't aware of that.
Mm.
But across that time frame, you must have seen so much. So what do you feel has changed the most in the online world? Do you think it's a better place now or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are being philosophical for a moment. Is I think we are technically uh, we are designed to basically keep going forward no matter what. And I think one of the things that's been good about the last 15 years is basically the innovation that's come in and the pace of innovation and how exciting it is. Is it a good world? I think yes, absolutely. And is it going to contribute to the successes of companies in the future? Absolutely. I think where the challenge lies is because the pace of evolution of this new way of doing things has been so rapid. I think an awful lot of businesses, corporations, multinationals are so far behind that the threat to be it global economies, local economies, or the small corner shop is what's not known, because something could come around the corner digitally and disrupt an industry so quickly that the industry that's basically been dominant and stabilized a particular economy could be fragmented so quickly, as is the case with Uber, as is the case with many other platforms. They come in, disrupt a whole industry, therefore an economy starts to question its kind of relevance. So I think the overriding thing is it's good, but I think what's fundamentally needs to be addressed is how fast organizations embrace new ways, which I think to some extent, I think we're coming to a point now where the likes of you and I are reaching a certain level of maturity of understanding whereby we can go into much larger organizations and technically propose very disruptive ways of doing things, knowing that the inherent DNA of what we do, which are slightly more senior people, we understand basically what the consequences could be. So therefore we can almost maneuver around certain obstacles that may come along that most people within the traditional corporate world probably wouldn't understand, because they operate in massive silos of relationship. So I think it's good and bad. It's good and bad is the simple answer to that.
It's a fair point. Just like the world, Phil, eh? Good and bad. No matter what, it's humanity, isn't it?
At the end of the day, we must all basically look at opportunities and give them a good chance. I think that's the underlying thought I have, really.
Yeah. One thing you've said to me in the past is that the cost of entry with the online world is very low. Do you think that's a good or a bad thing, or both?
Interestingly enough, giving that some thought, is that the cost of entry to start a business is very low, but the cost of entry and success is also very low. That's very relevant. So what we've actually done to some extent, and we've been kind of blindsided by it, is that what innovation within digital gives us is massive amounts of kind of small activities, which in a global sense is kind of a good thing because everyone's involved and employed in doing something. But it also blindsides people, because actually, without giving really good consideration in terms of how to run a business from a P&L and balance sheet point of view, is that you're really just guessing that if I put up a website, it's going to be the next big thing. And the celebrity kind of get rich quick, I'm going to be a .com billionaire tomorrow philosophy just does not work. It doesn't work. So I think, I think the relevance of basically having that experimental mindset, but also having very mature business thinking, kind of are married, but they're not married at the moment, if you get my meaning.
I do, and that's a great point. So one other thing you said to me is that digital is often considered a young person's thing, because they are so fluent on social media and are born into this world, aren't they?
Yeah.
But your point there, that this is separated from the more mature understanding of how to run a business.
Yeah.
And with those separated, how do you think organizations can begin to address that? What do you think they should do?
I think where organisations need to start, I think they need to start at the top level, at the senior management board, and principally the two decision makers, whether or not that's the chairman of a company or a CEO or the managing director. Is I think those people need to reach out to senior, very experienced digital people and just simply ask the questions. Ask the questions: is what's happening in the world as you see it? What consequence will that have to my business today? And what consequence will that have to my business today if I don't change anything? And I think, in terms of let's call them the levers of entrepreneurship, is that starting up a business and picking up the right levers will get you in the right direction. But I still think that, when the size of a company is £100 million, $100 million, or even bigger, I think that you need to have some maturity to the question of how quickly can we change direction. And I think the two things are kind of two different ways of doing the same thing, which is growing a company. But it's assumed that by carrying out a digital behaviour, you're ultimately going to be a successful company. You're not. You're going to be a successful company because you marry the digital behaviour with the financial and the business planning behaviour, and that requires experience, Phil. You can't just chuck anyone into that, whether it's someone who's 14 selling BMXs or someone who's basically in their 50s giving a .com a new start. It's I think age isn't relevant to the execution, basically.
No. I think you're absolutely right, and that point about marrying the two is a difficult thing because it is almost generational right now, isn't it? We can say that young people in general are better digitally, but that their parents and even their grandparents have more experience in the financial side of business and how a genuine business runs. So in many ways, both sides are looking for a bit of development.
Well, the interesting thing you say on that is that both sides are looking for this. Go back to my principal philosophy and the way I've kind of viewed my career is do what you're good at. Now the thing is that you're not always good at what you need to do, and it's so relevant in the digital space at the moment is that there's a massive assumption that basically no knowledge and no experience of running a company makes you more successful as a digital business. And it would also say that because you understand how to run a business, you can't work at the pace of a digital opportunity. What that is kind of circumventing is that actually there are people that have the ability and the experience to basically marry the two. And those people have evolved from being within the industry in the last 15 years. So people like me and you, for instance, is that we don't have to guess what we're doing. What we can do is we can basically adapt some of the technology, some of the learnings, and some of the energy from the experimental world of pure digital activities, be it the levers, and but we can apply those to basically what does it mean bottom line. Are we building a business that's going to be successful? Is it going to turn in the right direction quickly enough? What do we need to do to validate some of the information? Some of the old-fashioned ways of gathering information and building confidence still apply. They still apply. So it's about looking in the right place for the right tool, basically.
Absolutely. And in some ways, it's every company has to build its team, doesn't it? And one thing I sort of learned relevant to what you're saying in my career is it's better to form relationships with people who are different to you than the same. Whereas when I began forming companies and trying things, I would sort of naturally hook up with people who were the same. And all you do is you end up competing for a certain activity. And Jo that works with me every day, she is the organisation in what we do.
Yep.
I'll never be great at organising in the way that she is.
Yep.
But it frees me up to be doing what I feel better at.
Well, it's basically so it goes back to the same principles, which were the principles which I started off by saying is like one of the biggest strengths anyone can have, and it's a very difficult thing to get to. Is you need to know what your strengths are, and if you were to ask the majority of people that you work with or come into contact with, is what are you good at, and they know. It would be very useful for a start. And the next question you'd ask them is basically how much of your time do you spend doing that? And I think one of the things that be an intelligent digital mind does is it has the ability to basically pick up the right opportunities and the right levers, knowing that that's a strength that you understand. But if you don't understand it, you can also reach out very quickly to someone who's learned more than you very quickly. So I think it's build a team that basically support your weaknesses, but don't try and build a team of friends, basically.
Absolutely right. That's it in a nutshell. And Phil, you introduced me to a new role I didn't know was surfacing in the market the other week. When you mentioned CDO, which is very much the blossoming of what we're talking about here. So just tell everybody what a CDO is and what they bring.
Right. Well, this actually hit my radar because I was trying to question some of the relationships that we're trying to build at the moment, and I was trying to establish within these corporations that we're talking to as to am I talking to the right person? And one of the conflicts that seemed to be so relevant was I was talking to them and saying, I would love you to buy into our business, but you have to understand my digital proposition, and here it is, alongside the bit that you understand. And throughout basically a series of dialogues, I found that some of these very senior managers were starting to interrogate my understanding of digital from what they would need to understand. So I basically started to examine what I thought that was, and in terms of how influential that communication was and who I was talking to. And I dipped into, I think, a Price Waterhouse white paper that basically presented this chief digital officer, which is basically seems to be evolving within corporations, which is an individual that has enough political clout, be it the words, to influence the business. And I think the relevance of that is the chief digital officer is someone there from an executive board level or a C-suite level who has business maturity to know that his or her decisions would be relevant to the business. But at the same time, that person would also have full understanding of the ecosystem of digital. And so that's where the chief digital officer exists at the moment, is somewhere between the chief executive officer and the chief operating officer, somewhere in the middle.
Which is a relevance of how far digital has grown since those early days of you working at Virgin Megastore and me being at university at the same time.
Well, back in the day, and it's still probably relevant for an awful lot of very big organisations, is digital is seen as a marketing budget, which is fundamentally incorrect, because these marketing budgets, if you were to call them that, the marketing budgets that are being applied through very small, lean digital organisations like ours can be massively, massively disruptive to the business management of massive corporations. So by definition, if organisations say, digital lives in marketing, they've got it wrong, because that marketing is going to be blind spotting the business. So that's my view anyway.
It's a good view. And I think there's a lot in what you're saying. Does every company need a CDO? When you saw that, did you think, okay, in 15 years' time, every company will have this or the equivalent of it? And if not, what does the average company need? Because CDOs really came through large funded organizations, I'm guessing. Is that right?
Yes, so big organisations, be it multinationals, particularly one that I've seen recently, Coca-Cola, have actually appointed a very heavyweight chief digital officer in America, and he is a serious heavyweight in terms of his experience in terms of the digital universe. But I think what's relevant is his experience is relevant to the size of that company. I think if you were to take the next step down and say, does every company need a chief digital officer or a managing director with a digital CV, I've said in 15 years' time, every company needs to technically say you've got a managing director who has a full range of digital understanding. How that evolves itself is probably, there's a whole series of heads of digital and marketing managers and e-commerce managers that technically are not seen as influential to the running of the business. They're seen as influential to the success of sales. So they either sit underneath the sales or marketing, and they need to be escalated or elevated up to being someone that's got a relevant voice in terms of the future success and growth of the company. So to answer your question, in 15 years' time, most FT 100 or FTSE or Fortune 500 companies will have a CDO without a doubt, in my opinion.
Fantastic stuff. So this is all very big changes for traditionally structured companies. How do they adapt? How can they begin doing something about this right now? Let's say someone's listening to the podcast. They're a smallish company. Maybe they're based just in Yorkshire where you are, or even down in Cornwall where I am. What can they do from today to bring this influence into their company?
Right. Okay. Well, if we were to be based on this conversation and this point now, I think if we were to be relevant, this could give you some thoughts that I think are relevant. So five steps to kind of consider. I think the first thing to do is you basically get your management team together, and what you do is you sit down and you say the following words, which is: the world of sales is changing. How we access the customer is changing. And I think any business needs to say, are we in a position to understand what that means? Do we understand the fundamental, what's the DNA of the change? What has changed? Well, the change is simply customers are now choosing where they buy your product from or your service from. So are you in a position where you're aligned to the future? And I think it's just merely a conversation. If your business has not got itself pointed in the right direction, you have to start the conversation. That conversation may last one day, 1 week, a year, 3 years, who knows, 15 years. The next thing that's quite relevant is that, assuming that you understand that you've got a digital opportunity, I think the one thing to consider is part of the DNA of a digital company is actually understanding your audience, understanding where your customers are, and consider them as a more of a movement behind your beliefs and your values than actually the byproducts of a successful TV campaign. I think it's a question of getting involved in your community and understanding what the DNA is. So it's not a question of just like simply market research. I think it's actually about looking at various pieces of data, whether it's like keyword market research, or whether it's experimental postings on Facebook, or whether it's playing around with different engagement messages. It's really, you need to sit down and actually understand what the DNA of the movement behind your brand is, or your business. And I think once you've understood what they're all talking about and why they're there, I think you then have to kind of consider the law of pack. I think there's this, to introduce something for you to look at, is the principle set that I was introduced to in 97, 98 was this law called Reed's Law, which is what we want to do is communicate to the masses in order that the masses can communicate to each other. And I think that's very relevant when you look at the success of high-scale businesses or high-scale opportunities. Peer-to-peer communication and peer-to-peer management of the pack is much more relevant than basically chucking out an email, basically. So that third component is basically, how much control do you have of the segments? Call it segments rather than the fractions. Is like how much influence do you have on the segments within the pack? I think that's quite relevant in terms of those 3 points. Will basically get you a long way to understanding how you engage a digital business.
Brilliant stuff. So I love that word movement. So thinking of your customers, you've almost changed the word customers to movement, and because social media is two-way, we see that very much in action in the business you work in now, and various others that are doing very well online. There's a duality, isn't there? It's not just sales messages going out; it's two-way communication all the time.
Well, So So probably to put another part to expand the conversation is one thing that's relevant that is very confusing to the old-fashioned ways of doing things, and a lot of these very big established companies are doing things in the old-fashioned way, is that it's assumed basically that if you tell someone to buy something, they buy it. It's assumed. But that changed 15 years ago, Phil. That changed 15 years ago. What happened 15 years ago was people started to have control of what they bought, not how they bought it, but what they bought. They actually had control. So what happens now is that you have to basically manage the movement of your customers in terms of the movement being, a group of people that have shared beliefs, and you have to manage yourself within the conversation. And if you can't get inside the conversation, you're not relevant, and therefore you won't get the sales that you expect. Now, the old-fashioned philosophy still applies. Like if you do TV advertising, you ultimately spend 10 million on advertising, you will make some outputs. That is changing very quickly. And the likes of Martin Sorrell at WPP will basically probably, I think he's on tape to have said that way of doing things is going to change. And the evidence of that is programmatic marketing that's coming along, which is data and big data and group forming information that will lead you to a purchase that you didn't know you needed. And, if organizations aren't aligned to the way things now work, which is you can't sell without a movement or a shared belief, is that you won't be able to get your sales. You just won't be able to get them because you can't get in to sell. It's almost like a closed door. If you're not inside, you're not inside.
If you're not inside, you're not inside. That's a great sentence for people to think about. How do they reach out and get into that movement? It's such a big thought for any company, isn't it?
It's actually very scary, because what larger organisations don't have the ability to do, and the agility and the understanding, is they don't know how to get into the door that's closed. They think they can basically buy in to the door. And we all know that basically if you go to the front of a queue and you say to the doorman, here's 50 quid, I want to get in, he may say, well, sorry, mate, you don't look like the right sort of guy to come in.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how much money you give me, you can't get in. And I think this is like fundamentally part of the DNA of digital. And what a lot of companies don't get is that you need to open up a conversation, build a movement, understand the segments and the tribes within, and then put yourself in the right place so that when someone is willing to spend their money, they'll spend it with you because you are there at the right time and you're relevant. And that's where programmatic marketing is ultimately going to be incredibly disruptive. But companies that are involved in that type of behavior and understanding today, in 15 years' time, will be absolutely massive. So if there's the likes of, if there's a number of very big brands that technically don't understand their digital footprint, don't understand where their digital opportunities lie, and they're not gathering data today with the consumer, in 10 years' time, they won't be able to get in.
It'd be too late.
Be too late.
There we go. And, I'm thinking back to our opening chats, and companies like Uber, like Airbnb, they feel like movements, don't they? You can feel how they just come into the being of everyday life, and they've just run in there, and people have jumped on with them.
But they haven't at all. They've actually basically very carefully engineered a conversation. The conversation has got bigger. They've engaged more conversation, and then accidentally they basically, and to some extent, the success of Airbnb was an accident. But it wasn't an accident that was not planned. It was an accident that they intended to happen, which is the accident was, let's try something, see what happens, and if it works, we're onto something. And I think all too often one of the underlying things within digital and a digital community or digital movement, and therefore the success of your brand, is actually being seen as fair. Do things in a fair way, because if you're doing things in an unfair way, the door will be closed, and the door closes very quickly, very, very quickly. You can derail your community within a matter of hours or days, without doubt. But but as long as you keep the door open, you'll always have an opportunity. And I think some of the really big companies and really successful companies in the world may not have the doors open, may not understand that there's actually doors there. They just think that actually if they spend enough money, they make enough noise. And by making enough noise, they get a transaction. But that's just not the way it works. That's not the way it's worked for 15 years. The success of eBay is very relevant. You've got eBay, Uber, Airbnb, and lots of other peer-to-peer platforms. They're technically movements that think things are done right. And I remember looking at eBay back in 97, 98 and reading their values. You know, that business was built on a community, a movement that had shared values. And to some extent, if you look at the modern world of a digital marketing PPC girl, is that in theory, they should be doing things because they feel right. And all too often, they're doing things because they're being told that it's got the correct output. But, the success of a lot of the social media platforms would say they're being successful because they're allowing people to do things that are right, not things that should be done.
I think that's a great point, Phil. I think all those companies you mentioned, great social media platforms, they empower people, don't they, to do what they think is right.
And it's the power, it's the power of many to many that is more relevant. Yeah. And I think it's kind of it started off as a mathematical theory, but Reed's law and Metcalfe's law would state that what's more valuable is the relationship of many to many, not the relationship of one to one. I mean, that's obvious, Phil. The relationship that we share is a one-to-one communication today, but the relationship of the conversation that this podcast might share with others, that then the others share with the others, is the power of the pack. And and that's where, if people and organisations understand that philosophy, which has been the DNA of digital for 15 years, they're onto something, but a lot of them don't. So that's what I'm doing here at Gin Festival. Is basically I'm embracing the many-to-many concept.
What a great role! You seem to have had a career of great roles, Phil.
I think I've had some of the best jobs in the world. Looking back on it, I still would say that there's a lot more in it, and I think that the opportunity in terms of where I see things going is that in the next 10, 15 years in terms of digital is that, my influence to do with building new movements and building new communities and building new messages in order that organisations are seeing fair to their community of potential purchasers, and also the relationship of big data and programmatic marketing off of it would be, I think there's something in it in the future, Phil, something.
I think you'll continue to do very well, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Phil, it's been great chatting with you today. Tell us about where we can find you online.
Right. So basically, I'm not massively online as such, which is ironic to some extent. I'm more of an observer than an actual take-parter. But you can either find me at Phil Argent on Twitter, or if you feel like you want to touch base and have a chat, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone. And you can find me at phil.argent@ginfestival.com. Always happy to have a chat. Feel free to touch base.
Great stuff. With all these big messages we've been chatting about today and all these great things you've been telling us, your theories and your thoughts, any final message you want to give to everyone?
I think the final message to give people is that there is a huge opportunity within digital. I think digital is a different way of thinking. And I think what's important about understanding that is it's not about the sales, it's more about the community. If you get the community in the right place, you can introduce the sales. And it sounds very simple, but it's very complicated. It's move the priorities the wrong way around, basically. So in summary, if you can have the ability to change the priorities and trust in it, you'll win. You'll win.
Change the priorities. I like it. Phil, thank you so much for today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Inspirational.
Thank you.
I hope many people take the same from this that I do.
Great stuff. Thanks, Phil.
My name is Phil Byrne, and I'd like to thank you so much for listening today. I hope you got something really good to take away from this week's episode for you or your business. And you know what? I'd like to give you something more. In fact, I'd like to give you a whole free web marketing pack full of all my latest and best ideas on how you can take your business forward positively online. Download your pack at positivesparks.co.uk/pack. And most of all, guys, look forward to seeing you again next week.